to Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent. I'm Dimitri Mollo.
And I'm Olga Shurygina.
Today we'll be talking about intelligence from a somewhat different perspective. In past episodes we discussed what makes up human intelligence, in what ways other animals may be intelligent, whether and how artificial intelligence can be built, and even whether intelligence can be something collective, a property of whole beehives, ants colonies, and who knows, human societies. It seems that intelligence is something rather common in the world, but why?
In this episode, we will examine these questions, taking a look at some of the answers that have been provided to this most basic conundrum. Where did intelligence come from?
And answering these questions is not relevant just to evolutionary biology, the branch of science dedicated to figuring out the workings of evolution, and how they produced the various biological forms that exist today and have existed in the past. It can also help shed light on the nature and limitations of our intelligence and that of other animals, as well as give us hints about how we should go and try creating artificial systems that are actually intelligent.
Before getting to that though, let's take a step back. I think that the first question to ask, to put it very shortly, is why intelligence? In other words, why did evolution lead to organisms or collectives that are intelligent? We have lots of living beings that do not seem particularly intelligent. I mean, they do not do the kind of complex problem solving we typically associate with intelligence, and still they can be very successful in surviving and reproducing.
So are you asking something like, why don't we live in a world populated only by simple organisms like ticks, worms, sponges, that don't seem all that intelligent after all, but thrive all the same?
Yes, why would evolution lead to more than that? If it only cares about survival and reproduction, what's the point of building big brains to do complicated things if that doesn't seem needed for species to be successful from an evolutionary point of view? What evolutionary pressures were there that gave us, our fellow primates, dolphins and octopuses, the impressive intelligent abilities that they have got?
This is a great question. I don't think there is a very clear answer to that yet, but there are some ideas around that give us at least parts of a solution to this problem. One idea that the philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith has explored is that, to put it roughly, when the environment becomes very complex, with lots of opportunities and dangers, and lots of ways to interact with it, organisms need to find ways to deal with that complexity. One way is the one you mentioned. You remain simple and oblivious to that complexity. But that also means that you're missing lots of these dangers and opportunities, and you cannot really behave flexibly.
So the other strategy is to deal with the complexity of the environment by becoming more complex yourself.
That's basically the idea. To put it more precisely, when the environment is complex, evolution may have led to organisms that were better able to deal with that complexity, to be more successful in surviving and reproducing. And one of the most effective ways to deal with that complexity is to have good senses that take in lots of information about the world, and a brain that can make sense of that information, learn from it, and decide on a good way to act.
I guess this strategy is more risky and expensive, in the sense that it's more difficult to produce and maintain big brains, learn, and so on. But the benefits to reap from being better able to deal with a complex environment outweigh the costs.
Yep. So according to this idea, at least in some cases, investing, so to speak, in intelligence makes sense from the evolutionary point of view. This is not to say that the other strategy, remaining simple, is better or worse in general. It's just another evolutionary successful strategy among many.
Another idea I heard about is kind of related, I think, but different. The suggestion there, defended recently by the philosopher Fred Kaiser, sounds like this. It's not only the complexity of the environment that makes intelligence pay off as an evolutionary strategy. The complexity of the body itself requires intelligence.
What do you mean by complexity of the body?
Well, you have quite some limbs that can move in complicated ways to allow you to walk, pick up things, and so on. It may seem natural and easy to do, but actually lots of coordination and communication is needed behind the curtains, so to speak. Think about how your legs move just in the right way at the right moments when you walk, and how they adjust if a part of the floor is more or less slippery, and so on. Or perhaps don't think too much about that. It becomes quite difficult to walk normally if you actually are thinking about what are you doing.
That's true. So the idea is that in order to coordinate what this complicated body does in a way that makes it act in useful ways, something like intelligence is needed.
Exactly. You need something that can coordinate the body, and that's very important work that brains do.
And once you have a brain for that, you can also use it for all sorts of other things, I guess, that then we might call intelligence.
Yes, but careful. You are already assuming that coordinating the body is not something intelligent. And, as we have discussed in the past episodes, this is not as obvious as it might seem.
You're right, of course. I didn't think about that. I guess it's tough to shake out some intuitions that we have about what really counts as intelligent and what doesn't. Anyway, these two ideas are compatible in the end, aren't they? Perhaps intelligence evolved, where and when it did, both because of the complexity of the environment and the complexity of the bodies of living beings.
Yes, but it's unclear how much weight each of those factors had. And perhaps there are still others that we are not considering, but I think that sounds very plausible.
I agree, but then another question comes up to me. We've been talking about why evolution has led to organisms that are intelligent, with brains, complicated behaviors, and so on. But what about the how? Are intelligent organisms just born with pre-programmed intelligent abilities? Or is it more a matter of being very good at learning from experience with the world?
Oh, that's a tough question. In the past, people used to talk about these options as an opposition between nature and nurture, between genes and culture, between what's innate and what is learned. Today, it's becoming clearer that these strong oppositions are not very helpful. All of these factors interact in complicated ways.
But there is still a question, right, about how important they are, what exactly they do, these factors. Like, is our capacity for imitation, for imitating others, something that we are born with or something that we learn? And what about other intelligent animals? Is the story for them similar to the story for us?
Well, just wait a bit. We've spoken with some experts about exactly these questions and many more.
All right, see you after the break then.
Hi Solveig, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Olga. Absolutely happy to be here.
Our topic today is the evolution of intelligence. Dimitri and I talked about this a bit earlier. What would you like to add to that?
Oh, well, quite a bit. I talked with a couple of experts about lots of the questions that come up when discussing the evolution of intelligence, both in humans and other animals.
Nice. Who did you talk with?
I had a chat with Cecilia Hayes.
I'm a psychologist who works at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, and I work on the evolutionary origins of human cognition, of how the human mind works and how it differs from the minds of other animals.
And with Ali Boyle.
Sure. My name's Ali Boyle. I'm a philosopher by training, and I currently work as a research fellow at two places. I work at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence in Cambridge and the Centre for Science and Thought in Bonn. And I work with a group called Kinds of Intelligence, which is a kind of interdisciplinary group of researchers in philosophy and psychology and computer science who are interested in all things intelligence and the varieties of intelligence and mind and cognition that exist or could exist in both biological and artificial agents.
Great. So perhaps before going into the evolution of intelligence, what did they have to say about intelligence itself?
Well, they both distinguished some different senses of intelligence that I think are important to keep in mind. Here's Ali.
I think intelligence is a bit of a slippery one because I think that it picks out at least two distinct concepts. So as I use the term intelligence when I use it casually, I tend to be referring to just mindedness or cognition, or using cognition to kind of navigate the world and problems. And that's a thing of which there might be many different types and many different subtypes. But of course, there's this other use of intelligence, which has to do with like smartness or cleverness, which is how many people use the word in casual conversation. And that concept obviously has a more difficult history and is less readily applicable to creatures that span species boundaries, I think. Like, it's more difficult to make intelligence comparisons or say smart things about intelligence in that sense when you're talking about non-humans.
And this is Cecilia.
It's always tricky with things like intelligence, terms which are used in everyday life. You know, when we're standing waiting for a bus, we may describe a friend of ours as very intelligent or not. So it's used in everyday life, but it's also used in science. And very often there's a gap between the meanings in the two cases. And any kind of definition that you choose seems to be to have to honor the scientific understanding and the everyday understanding, or there will be, terrible crosstalk.
They have somewhat different views about what intelligence is in the more scientific use of the term. Ali admittedly prefers a liberal view in which lots of organisms count as intelligent.
But yeah, I personally tend to be inclined to start talking about intelligence or cognition when you have something going on that involves kind of action that isn't purely automatic. So when you're looking at an organism or a system that does something in a way that is kind of flexible and responsive to information, and isn't simply like an automatic in-out reaction. That I think is a fairly liberal approach to like when does intelligence or cognition come about.
While Cecilia seems to prefer perhaps more stringent notion.
Intelligence is an agent's autonomous problem-solving capacity. So, you can have an animal, human or otherwise, who does something very clever, like finding the materials to build a nest with a really complex structure. It's impressive behavior, but it's not intelligent because the information necessary to do that is inherited genetically from the bird's parents, as it were. It's not that particular nest-building bird who is coming up with the solution to the problem. In a way, it's the evolutionary process that came up with this solution. Whereas if you put, say, a squirrel in novel circumstances, say you set up a whole bunch of obstacles to prevent a squirrel from raiding your bird feeder. You want the birds to get the peanuts in there. You don't want the squirrel to get them. So you put up all kinds of hurdles for this squirrel. But very often the squirrel is able to solve these novel problems all by himself. His genetic inheritance, his evolutionary history didn't equip him to overcome aluminium foil hurdles and barbed wire and so on. These things weren't even present in the world that his ancestors lived in. He has the intelligence to solve those problems by himself. So I'd say, for me, intelligence means autonomous within the agent problem-solving ability.
Let me see if I understand how they disagree about this. So, Ellie would be happy to say that the bird building the nest in Cecilia's example is intelligent, because it's using information about the environment to solve the problem. Cecilia, on the other hand, wants to deny this, because for her, the solution to the problem must come from the bird itself, and not be something found by evolution that the bird just is pre-programmed to do. On the other hand, the squirrel overcoming obstacles to get to the food shows intelligence, because the solution to the problem is something it has to come up with by itself.
I think that's right.
The mental capacities that allow the squirrel to find a solution, those mental capacities may be inherited genetically from his parents, but he uses them to find a novel solution. So in a way, he has the equipment for solving new problems on board. So in a sense, it's him who does it. He finds the specific solution, even if biological evolution gave him the machinery that enabled him to find the specific solution.
By the way, some people on the web went through the trouble of actually building obstacle courses for squirrels in their gardens. It's very impressive how flexible, versatile, and insistent they can be.
In any case, both of them think that intelligence is something that also non-human animals have. So, are the difference between what humans can do and what other animals can do just a matter of a degree? Perhaps the squirrel is intelligent to degree 5 and humans to degree 9, for example. I'm just throwing numbers around here, but I guess you get my point.
Yeah, I think I get it. Actually, Ali is quite against that idea that there is a kind of ranking of intelligence. She thinks that many of the differences cannot be compared so neatly.
So I tend to prefer to think about differences in intelligence and cognition by breaking them down into claims about cognitive capacities, rather than like buying into this picture where we can kind of arrange all of the organisms and systems on a linear scale of intelligence or cognition, to say instead that intelligence and cognition is like a catch-all term for a whole bunch of cognitive capacities, any one of which might come in more or less complex forms. On the one hand, I feel the attraction of saying that intelligence or cognition is a phenomenon that comes in degrees, that there are like, you can have it in greater or lesser amounts, or that there are like more or less complex forms of it. But I think in general, that's a way of thinking about it that I prefer to resist. Thinking of this as a kind of linear thing of which one could have more or less, or like starts to break down when you start making comparisons not between humans and other species, but between other non-human species. Then it becomes a bit trickier, I think, to think of this as like a linear phenomenon, like this animal is smarter than this animal. And I think that's because when we're talking about cognition and intelligence, we're really talking about something that's multidimensional. So it breaks down into many different cognitive capacities. And humans look so impressive to the extent that they do because, I think, because we have a bunch of cognitive capacities. When you look at comparisons between different animals, you might find like some of them appear very smart in one way, some of them appear very smart in another way. And there's no like really straightforward way of saying, oh, this species is smarter than this species.
And this view of intelligence has important consequences for how we try to understand the evolution of intelligence. If intelligence is a host of different capacities rather than a single thing, then the evolutionary story we should get will be different for different capacities. No single explanation will ever cover it all.
I think that intelligence isn't really a unidimensional phenomenon. I'm inclined to think that there's not going to be one answer to how did it evolve, because different kinds of intelligence probably evolved in different ways in response to different pressures. So for instance, a certain kind of self-awareness, very basic level of self-awareness, evolved as a consequence of organisms becoming mobile. Because once you are able to move around, then you have this thing that starts to happen where some of the sensory inputs you get are kind of the result of things happening around you, but some of the sensory inputs you get are a result of you moving around. And you need to be able to discriminate the kind of self-generated sensory experiences or inputs that you're getting from the kind of outwardly generated. So just like the mere fact of having to move around creates pressure in favor of being able to do some kind of very basic self-other distinction, which you might think of as a very basic form of self-awareness. Bjorn Merker talks about in a paper called The Liabilities of Mobility. So I think that's kind of a story you can tell about how one specific component of cognition and intelligence got started. And that way of thinking about it, puts its origins very, very far in the distant evolutionary past.
Does that mean that we can never compare intelligence across species?
To some extent, but not quite. You cannot compare intelligence across species as a simple quantity, so to speak. On the kind of view that Ali is presenting, we could, for example, try to compare specific capacity important for intelligence, like memory, between humans and fish, or between fish and squirrels, and so on.
We shouldn't be talking about how intelligent an animal is or how intelligent an organism is if we're talking in this kind of cross-species comparison context. It makes sense, maybe, and I'm not even sure about this, to say that one human is smarter than another. I'm not sure that it makes sense to say that a dog is smarter than a cat, because I don't think that intelligence is a kind of unidimensional, like a single dimension along which we can place different species.
But I guess that some things will not be comparable anyway, like things that only humans seem able to do, like, I don't know, like doing maths.
Right, but even then, there is a more philosophical point that we have to keep in mind.
There are definitely things that only humans do. Whether we want to say that there is a capacity that only humans have, or one or more capacities that only humans have, is going to turn on how we individuate capacities, or how we say, like, this is one capacity and this is a capacity of a completely different kind. So, for instance, you might be tempted to say, well, only humans have language. I think, depending on how you think about what a language is, that's a plausible claim. There's certainly a way of defining language on which that's true. It's not the case, however, that only humans communicate. So do we want to say that communicating using language is like a completely different kind of cognitive capacity? Or do we want to say that that's just a kind of communication, and therefore it's not the case that humans have a special cognitive capacity that no other animals have? Rather, they have like a capacity of the same kind, but it's kind of different in some interesting ways.
Okay, so figuring out what is really unique and what is not can be quite tricky. And the same goes when we try to compare abilities across species. We have to try and figure out whether we are really talking about the same thing, because different species are very different in many ways.
Exactly. Then the issue also becomes conceptual and not just empirical. What concepts do we use to describe what's going on in different animals?
But even accepting all that, it seems to me pretty difficult to deny that humans are intelligent in a way that other animals are not.
I agree, and I don't think many people would disagree. But the challenging part is to figure out what it is that allows humans to do more intelligent stuff than other animals. One popular idea that Ali finds persuasive is the so-called social intelligence hypothesis.
But then, of course, there are like all the fancy things that humans do. And you're going to need to tell a very different story about where they came from. So one very popular story about how humans got to be the way that they are points towards the increasing complexity of primate social groups. And the idea is that the more complicated a social group in which you find yourself, the more kind of sophisticated social cognition you need. That also opens up some possibilities for other kinds of complex cognition. At least plausible, I think, that like many of the fancy cognitive tricks that humans have up their sleeves might have something to do with the fact that humans live in these complicated social structures.
Interesting. That sounds like a version of a kind of picture that I discussed with Dimitri earlier. The more complex the environment becomes, the more pressure from evolution for intelligence to evolve. And of course, having to deal with other animals in a group makes things very complex.
No doubt, the social intelligence hypothesis is indeed quite influential today. Now, we also discussed these questions about the evolution of human intelligence with Cecilia Hayes, and she has quite a lot to say about this. She has developed her own theory about that, taking the idea that social interaction was important for the evolution of human intelligence and bringing it quite some steps further.
I argue that they come from learning from others, that through social interaction, we don't only learn facts about the world and the way to do things. We don't only learn how to put on our shoes and that Damascus is the capital of Syria. Everybody knows you learn those kinds of things from other people. I'm saying we learn something more profound from other people, which is new pieces of cognitive equipment get constructed in the course of childhood through interaction with other people. And insofar as those pieces of cognitive equipment do their jobs well, it's because of an evolutionary process, a process of natural selection. But whereas we tend to think of evolution as acting on genes, the kind of evolutionary process that produces special ways of thinking in humans acts on these socially inherited things rather than on genetically inherited things. So I argue that special human-specific forms of intelligence are products of cultural evolution.
Let me see if I got this right. Cecilia's point is that many of the intelligent abilities that we have are not things that we are born with, but things that we learn from others. So it's not only pieces of knowledge that we learn, but also how to think in novel ways.
That's right. She has coined the term cognitive gadgets to refer to these novel ways of thinking that we acquire through social learning and culture. In a sense, they're pieces of technology just like our electronic gadgets.
So cognitive gadgets are like thinking gadgets just inside our heads.
Yup, I think that Cecilia would agree with that way of putting it.
Okay, then we are still left with the question, if social interaction and culture were so important for the evolution of human intelligence, how did they evolve to start with?
That's a great question, and here Cecilia makes a point that may sound quite surprising.
It's my view that we humans, when we're born, have minds which are very similar to those of other animals, similar to squirrels and rats, as well as to our closest ancestors, chimpanzees. Some of the abilities that you find in other animals are kind of supercharged in humans. So something like what's called working memory. Essentially, this is the size of the mental workspace that you have, how many things you can think about and manipulate simultaneously. And the size of that workspace seems to be a little bigger in humans than in other animals. So I think our biological inheritance is, in some cases, we have more of things that you find in other animals, but they're not different in kind from the minds of other animals.
In other words, according to Cecilia, we have advanced culture not because there are big differences in the kinds of abilities that humans and other animals are born with, but rather because we have capabilities that are a bit better, a bit more powerful. So we may have a better working memory, as Cecilia mentions, that allow us to keep more things in mind at the same time than other animals. And we also seem to be less aggressive towards each other, at least in comparison to most animals, making social cooperation easier and less dangerous. These abilities open the way to complex social groups, culture, and so on. And by having those, we ended up becoming more and more intelligent, acquiring more and more thinking gadgets throughout our lives and throughout the generations.
However, once we get to adulthood, I think we do have a number of pieces of thinking equipment which are nearly absent in other animals. We have language. We have the capacity to use numbers, mathematical cognition. We're able to copy the fine details of body movements and to think about the thoughts and feelings of other people. All of those things, they're examples of pieces of thinking equipment that humans seem to have in adulthood that no other animal ever gets.
Great. Then these gadgets we humans get through culture are not only such obvious things like language and maths, they also include an ability to imitate others and even to understand what other people are thinking, what they want, what they are planning, and so on. But these last things come so natural to us. Do we really need culture to get them?
Right, what you say sounds very intuitive, but there are reasons to think that this capacity of figuring out what other people think and want, which is called theory of mind, may actually come from learning from others.
So the capacity to conceive of one's own actions and the actions of other people as being due to the thoughts and feelings of this individual, to kind of model the behavior that you observe as being caused by these invisible interactions in the head between thoughts and feelings. And that there's really strong evidence that that is learned through social interaction, that when you sit down with a child and a picture book, you find that parents are in effect tutoring their child into conceiving of behavior as being due to beliefs and desires. So, for example, they might point to a little boy with his dog in a picture book, and the adult will say things to an infant like, oh, look, the boy is smiling. That means he's happy. Why is he happy? Because he's playing with the dog. Now, all of that is instruction on our everyday theory of mind. It's saying smiling indicates a certain kind of emotional state, happiness. And happiness comes from certain sorts of activities, like playing with dogs. And so through that kind of conversation between adults and children construct, or children in contemporary Western societies construct this way of predicting and understanding the actions of others.
And as you point out, theory of mind seems to come naturally to us, but there are other things like it that we learn as children.
I think by introspection, we don't know much about our minds, as it were. So in that sense, it's not all that surprising that something like theory of mind could be a cognitive gadget, and it's not obvious to us that it is. Compare it with the case of reading text. Now, I don't know whether you remember, I remember how hard it was to learn to read. I was actually quite late in reading, and I was bright enough in other respects, and I realized I was disappointing the people around me. But I would look at this, nonsense, these black marks on this white page, and it meant nothing to me. And then I remember the laborious process of breaking down these scribbles and so on into pieces and trying to imagine what the sound was and so on. So learning to read, and reading is undoubtedly a cognitive gadget. I mean, reading hasn't been around in humans for more than 5,000 or 6,000 years, not nearly long enough for biological evolution to give us the capacity to read. So it's a cognitive gadget. It's hard to acquire. But once you've acquired it, you can't resist doing it. If you see words in a language you understand, you can't stop yourself from knowing what they mean and what they would sound like. So I think something similar is the case with theory of mind. It might be actually pretty tough when you're an infant and a child to work out what's going on here. I mean, you've just got all these bizarre facial expressions and body movements, and you've got adults saying these things about wanting and thinking and happiness and sadness and all of this kind of thing. And it's all a buzzing confusion. But once you get the hang of it, it's automatic, and you can barely believe that there could be any other way of predicting behavior.
Then in different cultures, we should have differences in this ability, right?
Yes, and Cecilia thinks that there is good evidence suggesting that this is indeed the case.
But there's also anthropological evidence that we in the West now are highly dependent on this way of modeling the actions of others. That as individualists, we're inclined to see behavior as due to what goes on inside my head, what I want, what I believe will control my behavior. In more collectivist cultures, there's much more use of the social situation that a person is in and their social role in that society. So in these cultures, they have a much more subtle understanding of the range of social situations which can arise in the course of everyday life. They fractionate social situations into much finer compartments. They also have a more subtle understanding of what any given individual's social role is in a given context. And then they cross those two pieces of information. In this kind of situation, what will this kind of person do? That's how they predict behavior, rather than by making guesses about what's going on inside the agent's head.
Okay, so it seems like Cecilia's picture is quite at odds with some influential views according to which human intelligence is almost all in our genes, like evolutionary psychology or cultural evolutionary theory.
That's right. Her view diverges from both of these theories, even though it includes elements of both.
Standard evolutionary psychology tends to think that the special pieces of cognitive equipment that you find in adult humans are genetically inherited wholesale. We don't just genetically inherit, as it were, the ingredients for building them, things which are also found in other animals. We genetically inherit a program for the development of things like theory of mind and language. And it just unfolds, provided we get enough food and care, it will just unfold in the course of development. I am certainly disagreeing with that, but the classical evolutionary psychology view did something I think is really important, which was to say, look, we need to account for not just the evolution of behavior, but the evolution of the way the mind works. So I am following them in that. I'm saying that's a really noble goal. I disagree with you about exactly how the mind evolved, but you set the right path there. On the other hand, cultural evolutionary theory is rather like classical evolutionary psychology in assuming that the special pieces of thinking kit that you find in adult humans are products of genetic evolution. So I disagree with them about that, the way that I disagree with the classical evolutionary psychologists about it. But again, I take something from cultural evolutionary theory to be really important, which is the idea that what we learn from others, what has culturally evolved, is very important in determining human nature. In a way, I just take it a step further. They assume that the contents of thought and specific practical skills are learned from others. And I say, yes, they are, but not only those things. We also learn ways of thinking from other people. So I think you could say I build on both rather than rejecting both.
Well, that all sounds good to me, but can we say that other social animals like ants or meerkats have culture too, though maybe not like ours?
It's important to be clear on the notion of culture. It's supposed to mean something quite specific, so the cases you mentioned would not really count as involving cultural learning and cultural evolution.
Well, of course, you can use the word culture or cultural in a very liberal way, as many contemporary biologists do. And, snails can find food by following the slime trails of other snails. And there are many contemporary evolutionary biologists who would therefore say, so they're cultural. If they're capable of social learning, then they're cultural. The trouble with liberal definitions is it then forces you to find another word for the more specific thing that you want to refer to. So I would favor a more demanding definition of culture in which a species is cultural when their social learning amounts to a form of inheritance. What one individual learns from another depends not just on what the other has done, but on what the other knows. So there's actually transmission of information from one animal to another. So in the snail case, it might be that the leader snail found the food by chance. He was just wandering about and he came across a piece of lettuce. The other snail, by following his trail, also found the piece of lettuce. Well, that's good news for the second snail, but it's not that some knowledge has been transmitted from the first to the second. The first didn't know where the food was when he set off, whereas in the human case, say, take something like learning to read. You can only learn to read from somebody who is already able to read. You can't learn to read by listening to the speech of an illiterate person, because you need to look at the text and hear the words simultaneously as a child in order to learn to read. So when there's that kind of dependence, what I learn from you depends not just on what you're doing, but on what you know. Then you have the potential for cultural evolution, a Darwinian selection process, which is sifting information inherited socially rather than information inherited genetically.
An interesting and important consequence of all this, well, one of the many, is that many of the kinds of things that we can do that are intelligent can be lost. If Cecilia is right, and these things are not purely genetic, and so we're not born with them, but learn them from society and culture, then we have to be very careful, because if the social and cultural institutions that preserve and transmit social and cultural learning are damaged or disappear, then some of our thinking gadgets, our cognitive gadgets that allow us to be so intelligent, would be damaged or would disappear too.
My mind turns to the situation in Romania in the 1980s, where you had a lot of infants who were growing up without social interaction in orphanages. And maybe that gives us another extreme example, but not as extreme as a cataclysm that decimates the world population. But certainly if social and educational policy in an area of the world become so dysfunctional that some children just aren't getting the interaction with others that is needed for the inheritance of certain forms of social intelligence, certain cognitive gadgets, then those will be lost. I mean, to put that the positive way round, we need to ensure that educational and social policy acknowledges just how much we are getting from social interaction in the course of childhood, not only in school, but also in informal social interaction. So policies relating to parental leave and welfare, that means that you don't have parents who have no time to spend with their children, for example. Those policies are not some kind of optional extra. It's not something which can just be sorted out by sending children to schools, even if they're very good schools. Those are laying foundations for the development of modes of thought, not just giving children facts and specific skills.
Right. So, in a sense, our intelligence is partly something that we help build, and if we don't make sure that the new generations have the right environments to learn from others and acquire these gadgets, then they will be forgotten, just like past technologies and skills can go forgotten if they are no longer used.
Yes, like programming computers using punching cards, to mention a completely random example. Anyway, before we wrap up this conversation, I would like to come back to AI for a bit. I mean, one important point that seems to follow from what Cecilia is saying is that if we want to build general AI, we may need to use different methods and focus more on teaching, on social interaction with artificial systems, and also on making AIs that teach each other or even create their own cultures and ways of transmitting their own thinking gadgets.
That sounds very tricky and quite far from what we have now in AI, right? So I guess this would be something for the not so near future. I was thinking about some of the things that Ali said about different forms of intelligence in different animals. Perhaps something along these lines could help us with AI already now.
So you mean like treating AI systems as if they were animals from different species?
Yes, kind of. Or anyway, try to build AI that shows the kind of intelligence that non-human animals have, which may not require the kinds of complicated social and cultural processes Cecilia mentioned.
I think that would be helpful too. Actually, Ali had some things to say about this idea.
To some extent, artificial intelligence has been driven by our perception of what counts as intelligent behavior in humans. So there's a lot of interest in strategy games and things like that. It's like very smart people can play chess, very smart people can play Go. Let's build machines that can solve these problems. I think looking at all of the other intelligent life forms around us is useful because it sort of refocuses on questions about like what really makes up intelligence, like what are the building blocks, and how can we create synthetic minds that have those like very basic capacities. If you're like thinking about creating a synthetic mind and your sense of what the mind is or could be is primarily or solely informed by your sense of what human minds are like, then you're kind of limiting the possibility space of what you could build. One way in which I think we can learn from all the intelligences that are out there is by looking at the ways in which comparative cognitive scientists look at and investigate and evaluate intelligence and cognition in non-humans. Because there are lots of kind of methods in comparative psychology for investigating and evaluating non-human intelligence, which are potentially applicable to evaluating synthetic intelligences. So I think there are kind of methodological and conceptual things to learn from the science of animal minds if we're thinking about artificial intelligence.
I really like that. I also sometimes think that in AI we have been focusing a bit too much on human intelligence, which is probably very complicated and so very, very difficult to build. Perhaps it's more fruitful to start from the more basic capacities important for intelligence that other animals also have, as Alice suggests.
I think so too. And indeed, there are people in AI and robotics that go this way, at least to some extent, like Oliver Brock, who we talked to in episode 3.
Nice. Many thanks for this, Solveig.
Thanks to you. This was fun.
Fascinating stuff, Olga. Thanks for this.
My pleasure.
We are reaching the end of our first season, right?
Almost. We still have one episode to go.
Okay, so we've talked about intelligence in humans, in non-human animals, and in artificial systems. We also talked about collective intelligence, and today the evolution of intelligence. What is next?
Next time, we'll be looking at the boundaries of intelligence, and especially we'll talk about some recent ideas about intelligence actually being much more common than we might have expected.
More common in what way?
In the sense that not only some animals are intelligent, but perhaps also plants, and even cells and bacteria.
Interesting and quite unexpected indeed.
Yes, it may sound a bit crazy, but there are good reasons behind these ideas. But yeah, this is something for the next time.
Great. So see you then in the next episode of Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent.
And now, time for some trivia. Did you know that chimpanzees from different regions are culturally different from each other? Just the way humans in different regions of the world use different instruments to consume food, chimps from one area use their nut cracking or termite fishing tools differently from chimps from another region. These variations also extend to their vocalizations. Who knows, maybe that means that a Central African chimp will have a hard time to mingle in a party hosted by West African chimps. Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent, is a production of the Science of Intelligence Cluster in Berlin, part of the Excellence Initiative of the German Research Foundation. The podcast is produced, scripted, and coordinated by Aravind Battaje, Dimitri Coelho Mollo, Benjamin Lang, Nicolas Roth, Olga Shurygina, and Solveig Steinhardt. Editing by Valeria Becattini. The music was composed and performed by Solveig Steinhardt and Dimitri Coelho Mollo, and mixed and produced by Aravind Battaje. You can find and follow our podcast on Spotify and Apple Music and all your favorite podcast platforms. For show notes, links to additional material, more information, and to contact us, visit www.scienceofintelligence.de/punchingcards or follow Science of Intelligence on Twitter.